Rockaways Productions presents The Casey Waters Show, episode 491, A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, Part 3. Hello, I'm your host, Casey Waters. Today, I will continue with A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Here, the author looks at the history of the United States, told from the perspectives of various groups, such as the working poor, women, slaves, Native Americans, and others. Today's show will feature background footage from Rumbling Bald. Rumbling Bald hiking and climbing area is located on Boys Camp Road. To get there from Chimney Rock, North Carolina, take Highway 64 east, heading towards Lake Lure. After a short distance, right before the Broad River, you'll notice Boys Camp Road, going off to the left. Take a left on Boys Camp Road and follow it for maybe a mile or more. At the crest of a hill, take a left into the parking area of Rumbling Bald hiking and climbing area. This is it's fairly large. I guess it's not huge, but it has different aspects to it, different sides. This time, I went on the west side. So, now, let's continue with A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Grant Foreman, the leading authority on Indian removal, estimates that during confinement in the stockade or on the march westward, 4,000 Cherokees died. In December 1838, President Van Buren spoke to Congress. It affords sincere pleasure to apprise the Congress of the entire removal of the Cherokee Nation of Indians to their new homes west of the Mississippi. The measures authorized by Congress at its last session have had the happiest effects. Now, let's go to page 149 towards the bottom of the page and continuing on to page 150. Hitchcock was not mistaken. Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase had doubled the territory of the United States, extending it to the Rocky Mountains. To the southwest was Mexico, which had won its independence in a Revolutionary War against Spain in 1821, a large country which included Texas and what was now New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, California, and part of Colorado. After agitation and aid from the United States, Texas broke off from Mexico in 1836 and declared itself the Lone Star Republic. In 1845, the U.S. Congress brought it into the Union as a state. In the White House now was James Polk, a Democrat, an expansionist who, on the night of his inauguration, confided to his Secretary of the Navy that one of his main objectives was the acquisition of California. His order to General Taylor to move troops to the Rio Grande was a challenge to the Mexicans. It was not at all clear that the Rio Grande was the southern boundary of Texas, although Texas had forced the defeated Mexican General Santa Anna to say so when he was a prisoner. The traditional border between Texas and Mexico had been the Nueces River, about 150 miles to the north, and both Mexico and the United States had recognized that as the border. However, Polk, encouraging the Texans to accept annexation, had assured them that he would uphold their claims to the Rio Grande. Now, let's go to page 154 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. A handful of anti-slavery congressmen voted against all war measures, seeing the Mexican campaign as a means of extending the southern slave territory. One of these was Joshua Giddings of Ohio, a fiery speaker, physically powerful, who called it an aggressive, unholy, and unjust war. He explained his vote against supplying arms and men. In the murder of Mexicans upon their own soil, or in robbing them of their own country, I can take no part, either now or hereafter. The guilt of these crimes must rest on others. I will not participate in them. Giddings pointed out to the British Whigs, who, during the American Revolution, announced in Parliament in 1776 that they would not vote supplies for a war or oppose. They would not vote for supplies for a war to oppress Americans. After Congress acted in May of 1846, there were rallies and demonstrations for the war in New York, Baltimore, Indianapolis, Philadelphia, and many other places. Thousands rushed to volunteer for the army. The poet Walt Whitman wrote in the Brooklyn Eagle in the early days of the war, "Yes, Mexico must be thoroughly chastised. Let our arms now be carried with a spirit which shall teach the world that, while we are not forward for a quarrel, America knows how to crush as well as how to expand." Accompanying all this aggressiveness was the idea that the United States would be giving the blessings of liberty and democracy to more people. This was intermingled with ideas of racial superiority, longings for the beautiful lands of New Mexico and California, and thoughts of commercial enterprise across the Pacific. Now, let's go to page 156, continuing on to page 157 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. The war had barely begun. The summer of 1846, when a writer, Henry David Thoreau, who lived in Concord, Massachusetts, refused to pay his Massachusetts poll tax, denouncing the Mexican War. He was put in jail and spent one night there. His friends, without his consent, paid his tax, and he was released. 2 years later, he gave a lecture, Resistance to Civil Government, which was then printed as an essay, Civil Disobedience. It is not desirable to cultivate a respect for the law, so much as for the right. Law never made men a whit more just, and by means of their respect for it, even the well deposed are daily made the agents of injustice. A common and natural result of an undue respect for law is that you may see a file of soldiers marching in an admirable order over hill and dale to fight the wars against their wills, against their common sense and consciousness, which makes it very steep marching indeed, and produces a palpitation of the heart. His friend and fellow writer, Ralph Waldo Emerson, agreed, but thought it futile to protest. When Emerson visited Thoreau in jail and asked, "What are you doing in there?" it was reported that Thoreau replied, "What are you doing out there?" The churches, for the most part, were either outspokenly for the war or timidly silent. Generally, no one but the Congregational, Quaker, and Unitarian churches spoke clearly against the war. Now, let's go to page 172 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. The plantation system, based on tobacco growing in Virginia, North Carolina, and Kentucky, and rice in South Carolina, expanded into lush new cottonlands in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and needed more slaves. But slave importation became illegal in 1808. Therefore, from the beginning, the law went unenforced, says John Hope Franklin. From slavery to freedom, the long, unprotected coast, the certain markets, and the prospects of huge profits were too much for the American merchants, and they yielded to the temptation. He estimates that perhaps 250,000 slaves were imported illegally before the Civil War. Later on page 172, a record of deaths kept in a plantation journal, now in the University of North Carolina archives, lists the ages and cause of death of all those who died on the plantation between 1850 and 1855. Of the 32 who died in that period, only 4 reached the age of 60, 4 reached the age of 50, 7 died in their 40s, 7 died in their 20s or 30s, and 9 died before they were 5 years old. Now, let's go to page 175. Harriet Tubman, born into slavery, her head injured by an overseer when she was 15, made her way to freedom alone as a young woman, then became the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. She made 19 dangerous trips back and forth, often disguised, escorting more than 300 slaves to freedom, always carrying a pistol, telling the fugitives, "You'll be free or die." She expressed her philosophy. There was one of two things I had a right to: liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other. For no man should take me alive. Now, let's go to page 181 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. The Fugitive Slave Act, passed in 1850, was a concession to the southern states in return for the admission of the Mexican War territories, California especially, into the Union as non-slave states. The act made it easy for slave owners to recapture ex-slaves or simply to pick up blacks they claimed had run away. Northern blacks organized resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act, denouncing President Fillmore, who signed it, and Senator Daniel Webster, who supported it. One of these was J.W. Logan, son of a slave mother and her white owner. He had escaped to freedom on his master's horse, gone to college, and was now a minister in Syracuse, New York. He spoke to a meeting in that city in 1850. The time has come to change the tones of submission into tones of defiance, and to tell Mr. Fillmore and Mr. Webster, if they propose to execute this measure upon us, to send on their bloodhounds. I received my freedom from heaven, and with it came the command to defend my title to it. I don't respect this law. I don't fear it. I won't obey it. It outlaws me, and I outlaw it. I will not live a slave. And if force is employed to re-enslave me, I shall make preparations to meet the crisis as becomes a man. Your decision tonight in favor of resistance will give vent to the spirit of liberty, and it will break the bands of party, and shout for joy all over the North. Heaven knows that this act of noble daring will break out somewhere, and may God grant that Syracuse be that honored spot whence it shall send an earthquake voice through the land. Now, let's go to page 185. After Nat Turner's violent uprising and Virginia's bloody repression, the security system inside the South became tighter. Perhaps only an outsider could hope to launch a rebellion. It was such a person, a white man of ferocious courage and determination, John Brown, whose wild scheme it was to seize the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and then set off a revolt of slaves through the South. Harriet Tubman, 5 feet tall, some of her teeth missing, a veteran of countless secret missions piloting blacks out of slavery, was involved with John Brown and his plans. But sickness prevented her from joining him. Frederick Douglass, too, had met with Brown. He argued against the plan from the standpoint of its chances of success, but he admired the ailing man of 60, tall, gaunt, white-haired. Now, let's go to page 191. When, in September 1862, Lincoln issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, it was a military move, giving the South 4 months to stop rebellion, threatening to emancipate their slaves if they continued to fight, promising to leave slavery untouched in states that came over to the North. That on the first day of January 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. Now, let's go to page 199 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Andrew Johnson clashed with senators and congressmen who, in some cases for reasons of justice, in others out of political calculation, supported equal rights and voting for the freedman. These members of Congress succeeded in impeaching Johnson in 1868, using as an excuse that he had violated some minor statute, but the Senate fell 1 vote short of the 2/3 required to remove him from office. In the presidential election of that year, Republican Ulysses Grant was elected, winning by 300,000 votes, with 700,000 Negroes voting. And so Johnson was out as an obstacle. Now the southern states could come back into the Union only by approving the new constitutional amendments. Now, let's go to page 200. Black voting in the period after 1869 resulted in 2 Negro members of the U.S. Senate, Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce, both from Mississippi, and 20 congressmen, including 8 from South Carolina, 4 from North Carolina, 3 from Alabama, and 1 each from the other former Confederate states. This list would dwindle rapidly after 1876. The last black left Congress in 1901. Now, let's go to page 204. A Negro blacksmith named Charles Caldwell, born a slave, later elected to the Mississippi Senate and known as a notorious and turbulent Negro by whites, was shot at by the son of a white Mississippi judge in 1868. Caldwell fired back and killed the man. Tried by an all-white jury, he argued self-defense and was acquitted. The first Negro to kill a white in Mississippi and go free after a trial. But on Christmas Day, 18 1775, Caldwell was shot to death by a white gang. It was a sign the old white rulers were taking back political power in Mississippi and everywhere else in the South. Now, let's go to page 216 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. The stories of the anti-renter movement and Dorr's rebellion are not usually found in textbooks on United States history. In these books, given to millions of young Americans, there is little on class struggle in the 19th century. The period before and after the Civil War is filled with politics, elections, slavery, and the race question. Even where specialized books on the Jacksonian period deal with labor and economic issues, they center on the presidency and thus perpetuate their traditional dependency on heroic leaders rather than people's struggles. Andrew Jackson said he spoke for the humble members of society, the farmer, mechanics, and laborers. He certainly did not speak for the Indians being pushed off their lands or slaves, but the tensions aroused by the developing factory system and growing immigration required that the government develop a mass base of support among whites. Jacksonian democracy did just that. Now, let's go to page 218. In Philadelphia,
Casey Waters Show. Producer, Casey Waters. Graphic editing, Judson Laird. Please note our new email address, caseywaters2@caseywaters.com.